"Is there a sniper here?" General Marcus Harris's voice thundered across the Arizona desert, cutting through the thick midday heat. No one answered. The air was dense, shimmering with dust and silence. 13 rounds had already left their barrels, 13 misses. The steel targets trembled in the heat, and the training flag fluttered weakly like pride itself had just been broken. A woman's voice rose low, calm, steady. "Permission to try, sir." Every head turned. A logistics officer stepped out from the shade of a tent, simple uniform, no ribbons, no reputation. Laughter broke out among the younger soldiers. "She's not serious, is she? Logistics wants to play sniper now." General Harris narrowed his eyes. For a brief moment, his gaze seemed to touch a distant memory. Dust, smoke, and gunfire over Afghanistan. "One shot, Captain," he said quietly. "Make it count." Nora placed her hand on the Chaitak rifle, adjusted the scope. She held her breath. The wind shifted. A sharp crack split the air. 3.8 seconds of absolute silence, no one moved. Then ting, the sound of metal striking metal echoed across the desert. On the screen, the bullet mark glowed dead center on the target. The laughter was gone. Only silence remained, the kind born from awe. Harris spoke softly, almost to himself. "How did you calculate that shot?" Nora replied, her voice even and quiet. "Physics, sir, and a bit of memory." "Oh, if you believe that true courage isn't found in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence of those who've lived through war, subscribe to brave veteran stories and help us preserve the memory, dignity, and quiet honor of our silent heroes." Early morning in Arizona. The sky hadn't yet turned blue, but in the small room at the end of the barracks, Nora was already awake. No alarm clock, only the sound of dry wind scraping against the iron frame of the window, and the faint scent of desert dust slipping through the cracks. She sat up, her brown hair neatly tied back, her face still holding the quiet tension of dreams that never truly fade. On the table, an old steel coffee pot simmered softly, steam curling upward, filling the air with a heavy, bitter scent. Black coffee, no sugar, no cream. She had drunk it that way since her days on the front line, strong, harsh, unpleasant, but real. Nora spread a small towel across the floor, placed her palms flat, and began her push-ups. 1, 2, 3. 50. Short, steady breaths echoed in the small room. The cold metal floor felt like the surface of a rifle barrel at dawn. Sweat dripped in small beads, darkened the steel, then vanished. When she finished, she sat still, hands resting on her knees, listening to her heartbeat thudding evenly in her chest. No orders, no shouting. Discipline had long become part of her bloodstream, something no one could teach, only the battlefield could carve in. On the bed lay her old M2010 rifle, its body scratched and worn. It had been her companion for 7 years now, decommissioned and forgotten. She opened the maintenance kit, dismantled each part, cleaned it, checked the bolt hammer and scope, then reassembled it. Every motion was precise, reflexive, instinctive. 15 years of service had trained her body to act even when her mind wandered somewhere between past and present. 4 minutes. Not fast. Not slow. Perfect. She placed the rifle down her palm, gliding over the cool barrel. Dim morning light slipped through the window, gleaming across the metal. Her voice rose barely above a whisper, as if speaking to the weapon or to herself. Muscle may forget, but the soul never does. The words hung in the air, heavy as a bullet waiting in the chamber. Outside, the base began to wake, truck engines rumbling, steel doors opening and closing, boots striking the ground in rhythm. Another day was beginning. Nora stood, zipped up her jacket, adjusted the shoulder straps, and fastened the faded logistics insignia that had long lost its shine. Through the small window, dawn painted the mountains red, reflecting off rows of idle military trucks. From her vantage point, she could see the training field below, young soldiers running, laughter mixing with shouted commands, shirts soaked in sweat. A few waved to her as they passed, calling out teasingly, "Morning Queen of Logistics." She nodded slightly, answering with a calm look, neither amused nor offended, simply steady like the uniform she wore. She knew they meant no harm. They just hadn't learned yet that silence speaks its own language. Nora watched them, and for a brief moment her gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the flag swayed gently in the early light. Others might see coldness in her stillness, but inside her ran something else, a focus honed by years, by loss, by sleepless nights. She didn't resent them. She had simply moved beyond the need for recognition. The clock on her desk blinked 05:42. She slipped a small notebook into her pocket. The cover creased the pages, filled with numbers and formulas, wind speed, bullet drop, trajectory angles. What others might call theory, she called survival. She locked the rifle case, opened the door, and stepped into the corridor. Desert wind rushed past, carrying the scent of gun oil and warm sand. The first sunlight spilled across her skin, revealing faint scars along her arms, old marks painless now, but never gone. Nora inhaled deeply. Her breath was slow, steady. Today would be another long day, inventory charts, paperwork, half-curious, half-condescending glances. But none of it mattered. Every breath, every movement was part of the precision she had vowed to keep alive. She crossed the yard, her boots leaving clear prints in the gravel. She didn't seek praise. She didn't wait for anyone. She simply did what she'd always done, exist quietly, but never disarm in spirit. A young recruit jogged past, calling out, "Good morning, Captain Hayes." Nora nodded, her eyes already fixed far ahead on the firing range where the metal targets gleamed in the rising sun. In that gaze lived something unwavering, a calm that wasn't weakness but strength waiting for the right moment to awaken. And as the sun climbed higher, laughter from the young soldiers echoed across the base. Nora had already left the barracks, walking straight toward the ammunition depot, where the first careless words of the day were waiting for her. The sun stood high overhead as Nora walked down the long road toward the ammunition depot. The midday heat scorched the concrete, bouncing harsh light off rows of steel crates stacked neatly along both sides of the path. Her steps were steady, her shadow stretched long across the pavement. In one hand, she carried an inventory clipboard, her handwriting clean, precise, and aligned. From the training field nearby came the sound of laughter, sharp and youthful, carrying the kind of joy found only in those who had never tasted real war. One of the young soldiers whistled, his voice laced with mockery. "Hey, Queen of Logistics! You bring us those donuts yet?" Nora didn't respond. Her eyes flicked in their direction for barely a second, assessing like a reflex southeast wind flag. Tilted 12 degrees, the one who spoke limped slightly on his left leg. The man behind him favored his right shoulder when carrying weight. Everything registered cool and clinical. She kept walking her pace, calm but unshakable, until their laughter died on its own. At the door, she greeted Sergeant Chen with a short nod. He returned it, his gaze quiet and thoughtful, the kind of look that only comes from someone who's seen too much. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oil and steel. Nora set the clipboard down, pulled off her gloves, and began her work. The scratch of pencil on paper and the metallic clink of cartridges filled the room, steady as a heartbeat. A new recruit entered, tall, lean, nervous. He was carrying a crate far too heavy for him. His boots slid on the smooth floor. The box fell with a loud crash that echoed through the warehouse. Bullets rolled everywhere, glinting under the yellow light. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean," the young man stammered, kneeling to gather them. Nora said nothing. She crouched down beside him, picked up one round after another, her fingers brushing over the brass shells, feeling their weight, their balance. 762, 556, 338 Lapua. Without looking up, she sorted them each round, placed precisely where it belonged. In less than 30 seconds, the chaos was gone, the floor returned to order. She stood, wiped her hands on her pants, and said evenly, "You can tell by the weight and the grooves. It's not hard." The recruit's face flushed. He nodded quickly but couldn't meet her eyes. She turned away, her movements neat, exact, and quiet. Sergeant Chen, still by the doorway, watched her with a faint shake of his head. Under his breath, barely audible, he muttered, "No one learns that unless they've fired for real." Nora heard him, but didn't react. The pencil in her hand continued to glide across the page. The rows of numbers perfectly aligned, her breathing steady. She didn't need to explain herself. This was what she did, taming disorder with calm precision. Outside, the group of young soldiers still lingered near the door, but none of them spoke. One of them finally whispered, "She must have been in combat." Another answered softly, "Oh, she still is." Nora closed her notebook, clipped her pen onto her pocket, and walked out. The young men stepped aside instinctively. No glare, no words, only the silence of someone who's lived long enough to know that words mean little when actions have already spoken. Outside, the heat pressed down heavier than before. The desert wind whipped around the flags, snapping the fabric sharply in the sun. She narrowed her eyes, one hand shading her face, the clipboard under her arm trembling lightly with each step. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes carried that familiar glint, a cold steadiness known only to those who had seen death and walked away from it. She kept walking, never once looking back. Behind her, the laughter had vanished. The soldiers scattered quietly, uneasy in the presence of something they couldn't name. Sergeant Chen stayed by the door, watching until her silhouette disappeared in the glare of the light. At noon, the sun burned white on the concrete. Each of Nora's footprints remained clear, dark impressions against the brightness. A quiet reminder that some people don't need to prove themselves, simply existing is proof enough. And that afternoon, when the base alarm sounded and voices called the troops to assemble, every eye turned toward the testing range where General Harris waited, and a challenge awaited them all, one that no one yet realized would change everything. Noon blazed over the Arizona desert. On the vast testing range that stretched beyond sight, 13 of the base's finest marksmen stood in a row. Behind them, on a small raised platform, General Marcus Harris watched in silence. The air was heavy, rippling with heat. The wind swept through, snapping the training flags sharply. Grains of sand swirled in thin spirals under the relentless sun. They had been shooting all morning, and all had failed. 13 bullets fired. 13 sharp cracks echoing across the range. 13 misses. 4,000 meters. A distance so extreme it seemed to mock even the most seasoned snipers. General Harris lowered his binoculars, his face expressionless, not angry, just still. He spoke quietly, barely loud enough for the officers beside him to hear. "Anyone left who hasn't tried?" No one answered. The silence pressed against the skin. Then through that thick, dry air came a calm female voice. "Permission to try, sir." Every head turned. Captain Nora Hayes stepped forward, her combat boots grinding softly into the sand. The logistics insignia on her chest caught the light. From the crowd of young soldiers came murmurs, half disbelief, half laughter. "She can't be serious. A logistics officer. 4,000 meters. That target's going to laugh first." Nora didn't respond. She didn't even glance their way. She just walked toward the firing table where the Chaitak intervention rifle rested sleek and waiting. General Harris watched her closely. Something in his expression shifted, a flicker of memory, faint but persistent. He couldn't place it yet. She stopped, unbuttoned her pocket, and pulled out a small, weathered notebook. Its corners were frayed. Faint coffee stains marked the cover. She opened to the last page. Lines of handwritten equations filled every inch. Wind direction, velocity, humidity, pressure, Coriolis effect, spin drift, air temperature, differential. No instruments, no laser rangefinder, just her eyes and her experience. From her cargo pocket, she drew a single bullet, silver casing, a small etched line across the tip, her personal mark. She laid it on the table for a moment, as if greeting an old friend, then chambered it. The laughter faded. Curiosity, then unease, took its place. Nora dropped into position. The rifle stock pressed tight against her shoulder. Her finger found the trigger. The wind shifted again. She narrowed her eyes, adjusted the scope by fractions. Her lips moved silently, numbers only she could understand. Sweat gathered at her collar, but her breathing stayed steady. General Harris raised a hand, signaling the range officer. Over the loudspeaker came the call, "Target distance 4,000 meters. Wind southeast. Visibility limited." Every sound vanished. Even the wind seemed to pause. Nora drew a slow breath and held it. Then gently, she squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked sharp and clean. The bullet tore through the air, leaving a faint white trace of smoke. Time bent and stretched. No one knew if it was fast or slow. 3 seconds. 4. Then 5. Ting! A crisp metallic note rang out across the range. The screen at the far end flickered, displaying a perfect impact mark, dead center. A flawless circle, not a millimeter off. No applause followed. The world had gone still. The flags stopped moving. The silence that filled the air wasn't emptiness. It was reverence. General Harris stood, frozen eyes fixed on the screen. His sunglasses trembled slightly in his hand. Nora removed her ear protection, engaged the safety, and set the rifle down with care like a sacred object. She lifted her gaze, her face calm, no pride, no triumph. Her breathing was the same as before. She fired. Harris took a few slow steps forward, his voice low, incredulous. "You calculated all of that with your eyes?" Nora met his stare, her tone even. Wind 14.3 miles per hour. Left drift 1.8 meters. Drop 0.4. Temperature 96 degrees Fahrenheit. Pressure 30.12. "I just did what I've always done, sir. Recalculate what I've already lived through." He said nothing. A long pause stretched between them, the kind of silence filled with recognition. Harris drew in a deep breath, looking at her like a man who had just rediscovered something he'd lost, not just belief, but memory itself. Behind them, the soldiers lowered their heads. None dared to break the moment. They all understood then that strength wasn't muscle or rank. It was the ability to stay steady when the world doubted you most, when laughter turned to doubt, when ghosts of the past still whispered in your ear. Harris turned to leave, then stopped. His voice dropped to a near whisper meant for no one but himself. "I've seen that look before, in Kandahar." Nora bowed her head slightly, saying nothing. The noon light fell across her face, catching the faint scars along her neck, tiny white lines like a map of where she'd been. And as realization settled over the field that they had just witnessed something beyond human precision. Harris looked back at her once more. His eyes no longer belonged to a commander giving orders, but to a man who suddenly remembered the soldier who had once saved his life. Later that afternoon, in the quiet of the command office, he would ask her the question that silenced the entire base. "You were in Afghanistan, weren't you? 2016, under the code name Viper 1. General Marcus Harris stood frozen, his eyes locked on the large screen displaying the image of Nora's bullet dead center in the target. The desert wind had gone still, leaving only the sound of hearts beating and shallow breaths from those who had witnessed it. He stepped forward slowly, each thud of his boots against the ground, carrying a weight that matched the silence around him. No one spoke. Everyone waited for him to break it. He stopped beside her, his voice low, roughened by emotion. "How did you correct for that?" Nora lifted her head, meeting his gaze without a tremor. "Wind, 14.3 miles an hour. Left drift, 1.8 meters. Drop point 4. Temperature, 96 degrees Fahrenheit. It's all just math, sir." A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd. Lieutenant Morgan, a young officer, leaned slightly toward his comrade, afraid to disturb the air. "No one can do that with the naked eye," he murmured. The words vanished almost instantly into the hot wind, but Harris heard them. He didn't reply. He just kept staring into Nora's eyes. And in that gaze, a memory returned, dim moonlight over the Afghan hills, gunfire echoing in the dark, and the cold certainty of a man who knew he would die if one bullet didn't find its mark. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Afghanistan, 2016. You were there." Nora straightened her hand, tightening slightly at her side. "Yes, sir. I was your overwatch. Call sign Viper 1. Time seemed to stop. The entire line of officers went still, breath caught in their throats. Harris took half a step back, eyes wide. He stared at her for a long moment, then spoke, his voice thick, disbelieving. "My God, you saved my whole unit." The scattered murmurs faded into an almost sacred quiet. Every soldier, every officer on that range felt something shift inside them, a kind of respect that didn't need orders or ceremony to exist. Harris inhaled deeply, then did something no one expected. He stood at attention, his body straight as an iron post. He raised his right hand in a formal salute. His voice carried across the range, deep and unwavering. "Welcome back, Viper 1. Nora returned the salute, crisp and flawless. Her eyes remained calm, though a faint tightness gathered in them, a quiet swell of emotion restrained by discipline. In that moment, rank, gender, and past no longer mattered. There were no superior officers, no subordinates, only two soldiers, one who had once given the order and one who had once saved his life. From behind them, Lieutenant Morgan moved first. He snapped to attention, hand rising to his brow. Another officer followed, then another. One by one, every soldier on the field raised their hand in salute, perfectly silent. No one shouted, no one cheered. They simply stood there, heads bowed in a gesture of reverence they would never forget. Then softly, at first, applause began. A few claps, scattered and hesitant, then growing swelling, until the sound rolled across the range like distant thunder. It wasn't the applause of celebration, but of recognition for someone who had lived for her comrades, then chosen silence for years afterward. In Harris's eyes glimmered a mix of pride and regret. He looked at Nora not as a commanding officer, but as a reminder of the kind of courage that never fades, even when buried beneath the years. Nora lowered her hand and faced the formation before her. She didn't smile. She only nodded once, quietly. The wind picked up again, carrying the rustle of the American flag behind her. Red, white, and blue rippled in the sunlight, casting a soft glow across her face. For a heartbeat, the entire scene looked suspended in time, an image carved into the memory of everyone present. A young sergeant, barely out of training, whispered to the man beside him, "She's the reason I wear this uniform." No one answered. They just watched, as Nora turned, walking slowly away from the firing line, the small notebook still in her hand. General Harris stayed where he was, his eyes following her, until her figure disappeared behind the line of steel crates. He lowered his arm, took a long, deep breath, and murmured almost to himself, "There's no greater honor than serving beside someone like her." Far in the distance, clouds began to gather. The sunlight softened, the air cooled. Yet no one moved. The soldiers remained rooted in place as if bound by the moment, because something profound had stirred within them, the realization that dignity doesn't live in decorations or titles, but in the quiet integrity of those who act without needing to be seen. That evening, in the small command office, Harris opened a sealed file. The name Viper 1 had been crossed out in red ink. He stared at it for a long time. He knew their next conversation would not be about a single perfect shot, but about the years that had been erased from record, the unseen battles and the silent weight carried by a soldier whose loyalty and wounds had never truly been allowed to rest. The command room was so quiet that the faint rustle of paper could be heard as General Marcus Harris turned the brittle pages of an old file. The ink had faded, but the words remained sharp and uncompromising. Ghost Unit 47 confirmed. Saves 17 missions, 0 casualties. He looked up at the woman standing before his desk. Nora was still in her plain uniform, hands clasped neatly behind her back, posture, straight expression, unreadable. Ghost Unit Harris said softly, his voice low and deliberate. 47 lives saved, 17 missions without a single casualty. Almost a perfect record. So why did you walk away? Nora didn't avert her gaze. Her answer was calm, simple, and steady. Because I got tired of shooting people, sir. The silence that followed was heavy. Sunlight from the window fell across the tactical map on the wall, casting long lines of gold across the desk. Harris nodded slowly, fingers interlaced before him. I understand, he said quietly, but that shot today, that wasn't luck. That was something only those who have stared directly into war could ever comprehend. Nora said nothing. She neither accepted it as praise nor rejected it as reproach. Inside, his words felt like both a compliment and a warning. Harris opened a drawer and pulled out a small mahogany box. He set it gently on the table and slid it toward her. No ceremony, no flag, no press. Just gratitude. He paused, meeting her eyes. It's not official, but it's deserved. Nora's fingers brushed the wood. She lifted the lid. Inside was a small, tarnished medal. No ornate design, no shine, just a single inscription for service beyond duty. Her hand closed around it, and her breath caught for an instant. Thank you, sir, she murmured. Harris leaned back, then drew out another folder, this one new and thick. He pushed it toward her. We're reinstating the Ghost Unit, he said. New name, Project Phantom. Objective to train soldiers who can move in the dark, handle the missions no one else will admit exist. I want you to train them. Nora raised her eyes, the deep brown of them reflecting the lamp's light. Train them, yes, Harris replied with a slow nod. No one understands the limits of the human mind and body better than you, and no one understands the cost of precision the way you do. She opened the folder. Inside were photographs of 5 young soldiers, 2 women, 3 men. Faces full of eagerness, eyes bright with ambition. They reminded her of herself 10 years ago, before experience had carved its lines into her face. Her fingertips brushed over the first-page service records, shooting stats evaluations. They had skill, yes, but they were still too young. Too unscarred to understand that courage isn't just pulling the trigger, it's knowing when not to. Nora closed the folder and lifted her head. If I accept, she said, I'll teach them what the battlefield never does. Harris leaned forward slightly. And what is that? Her voice dropped measured and soft. That precision is also a form of compassion. Every bullet fired is a life won on this side or the other. I'll teach them to respect that before they ever touch the trigger. Harris studied her for a long moment. In his eyes was a mix of pride, regret, and something close to gratitude. He said almost to himself, if more soldiers like you were still here, maybe war would be a little less cruel. Nora allowed herself the faintest of smiles before standing at attention. I can't change war, sir, but I can change how people fight it. Harris rose to his feet and extended his hand. They shook firmly, quietly, the kind of handshake shared only by those who understood the value of silence over speeches. Welcome back, Captain Hayes, he said. Nora replied gently, I never really left, sir. I just stopped to breathe. The room fell still again. Outside, the late afternoon sun slanted through the window, laying a warm golden streak across the desk, where the medal still rested. Harris looked at it, then back at her. Tomorrow, he said slowly, you'll meet your first team. They'll need someone to teach them how to be ghosts. Nora nodded, her eyes still fixed on the medal in her palm. The reflected light shimmered softly, as if the medal itself was alive. That night, as she left the command office and passed the memorial wall at the edge of the base, she stopped. The names carved into the black stone glowed faintly beneath the moonlight. Her hand touched the cold surface, tracing the grooves of memory. And in that still moment, she understood every piece of glory comes weighted with pain. Tomorrow she would begin teaching the next generation how to face that truth with composure, with compassion, and with the kind of memory that never fades. The Arizona morning was colder than usual. A thin mist hung over the black granite memorial wall on the eastern edge of the base. Nora stood in silence, her shadow cast across the polished surface that reflected the first light of dawn. On that smooth stone, hundreds of engraved names stretched in unbroken lines, each one a story, a heartbeat, that had stopped somewhere on a battlefield. She raised her hand gently, her fingertips tracing 4 familiar names. Torres Chen, Park Walsh, the ones who had stayed with her on the final day of Ghost Unit. Her voice came low, quiet, and raw. "I'm sorry. I couldn't save all of you." The wind swept through the row of flags behind her, the flapping fabric whispering like voices from the fallen. General Harris stood beside her, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the names. His tone was calm, steady, but full of gravity. "But you saved 14 others. Without you, there would be more names on this wall." Nora stayed silent. Her gaze fell upon the last name, Walsh, James E. Memories played back like an old reel of film bullets slamming into walls, the radio crackling with static, Walsh's voice shouting through the dust storm. "Take the shot, Hayes! We'll move!" She remembered firing until the barrel burned red, until her ears rang, until all she could hear was her own heartbeat. Her voice trembled almost like a confession. "Math doesn't make the pain any lighter." Harris nodded, eyes still on the wall. "No," he said quietly, "but it turns meaningless loss into memory with purpose. And that's what keeps us standing." Nora smiled faintly, a rare smile tinged with bitterness. "I didn't come back for victory," she said softly. "I came back because they can't." Harris turned toward her, his expression filled with something deeper than admiration, respect, and something close to reverence. And that he said slowly, "Is why you have to lead the next generation. No one understands survival better than you. They need someone to show them that courage isn't about pulling the trigger. It's about knowing when not to." Nora lifted her gaze to the wall again. The desert wind blew past, making the ribbons on the memorial wreath flutter gently. She inhaled deeply, her voice steady. "Then I'll teach them that. Not with speeches, but with the scars I carry." Harris looked down at her hands. Small, pale scars dotted her fingers. Fragments of metal powder burns years of heat and repetition. His voice softened. "You don't need to hide those, Nora. They're proof that you've been through hell, and you're still standing." Without looking at him, she replied quietly, "They only remind me that precision alone doesn't save people. Compassion does. I want them to learn that before they ever learn to fire." The silence between them deepened, comfortable, heavy, necessary. In the distance, the base siren sounded, calling soldiers to morning training. Nora straightened, taking a long, steady breath, her eyes turning toward the training field already glowing under the rising sun. "You'll do it," Harris said, his voice certain. "And I believe the names on this wall will be proud of you." Nora turned to him, and this time her smile was soft, honest. "I don't know if they can hear me, sir," she said, "but I'll live as if they're standing right behind me." Harris nodded once, his eyes glistening, though his voice remained controlled. That's how real soldiers keep going, by carrying the fallen in every step they take. Nora bowed her head, placing her hand on the wall one last time. The stone was cold beneath her skin, yet her heart felt warm. "I owe them a promise," she whispered. "If I'm still standing, I'll make sure others learn to bow their heads before sacrifice." Harris's voice came soft, almost a farewell. "And that is your legacy, Nora Hayes." She turned toward him, nodded lightly, and began to walk away. Her silhouette merged with the golden light of morning. Her stride firm, her back straight, each step deliberate. The desert wind rose again, sending the flag high into the sky, its red, white, and blue rippling brightly across the memorial's reflection. The 4 names beneath her hand remained there, still silent, but alive in the breath of the one who remembered them. Hours later, when Nora stood before the first recruits of Project Phantom, she realized Harris had been right. The fallen were still watching, and in that moment, legacy was no longer something buried in the past. It was beginning to take shape in the eyes of every young soldier standing before her. That morning, the Arizona sky was clear and vast. Clouds drifted slowly overhead, as if pausing to witness what was about to happen. On the parade ground of the base, rows of soldiers stood at attention full. In full-dress uniform, the American flag rippling gently in the breeze. At the center stood a small wooden platform, no backdrop, no reporters, no cameras, just a few rows of chairs and a sea of silent faces. General Marcus Harris stepped up to the microphone. His voice was deep, deliberate, each word carrying the weight of respect. "Captain Nora Hayes, Viper 1, he said. His eyes fixed on the woman standing tall before him, a symbol of quiet strength, of loyalty, and of precision that never needed applause. Nora didn't move. Her face remained calm, composed. The morning sunlight reflected off the small medal on her chest. When Harris finished speaking, she stepped forward, her voice steady, clear, and measured. "I'm not a hero," she said. "I just learned how to aim better, so fewer people would have to die." She paused, scanning the young faces before her eyes resolute. "Precision," she said, slowly, each word soft but sure, is compassion." The wind swept through the flags, carrying her words across the field. A moment later, the sound of a bugle rose low, solemn, and warm, like the whisper of unseen souls. Harris bowed his head, then raised his hand in salute. The entire field followed. For a few seconds, there were no ranks, no gender, no generations, only a single truth, real: courage is always silent. When the ceremony ended, Nora removed her gloves and shook hands with each soldier in line. Each handshake was firm, brief, but heavy with unspoken emotion. A young private, barely 20, murmured, "Ma'am, I'll remember what you said." Nora smiled faintly, her eyes soft. "Just remember," she replied, "every bullet is a promise, not a trophy." The day slipped toward dusk. The western sky turned purple as Nora stopped before the waiting C-130 on the tarmac. Under the yellow floodlights, the silver body of the aircraft gleamed like the wing of some giant bird. She carried 2 small bags and her old rifle wrapped in oilcloth. In her jacket pocket rested a single silver casing etched with the coordinates of Afghanistan, the last remnant of a life she'd left behind. She paused before climbing the steps. Slowly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the casing. The metal caught the light, casting a pale glow across her face. For a moment, she looked at it, as though seeing her old teammates again, Torres, Chen, Park, Walsh. Their names still echoed in her heart. Her voice was barely audible above the hum of the engines. Ghosts never die. The roar of turbines swelled. Harris stood a few yards away, hands clasped behind his back, watching. He didn't call out. He understood some people are meant to leave in silence, not because they're running from something, but because they've already given everything they had. As the C-130 began to taxi down the runway, Harris raised his hand in salute. His fingers trembled slightly in the desert wind. The plane lifted off wheels, leaving the earth climbing into a sky painted in streaks of violet and amber. Below, the flag still waved, red, white, and blue intertwining, like the lives of those who had fallen, so that others could keep living. Inside the dim cabin, Nora sat by the window, her profile lit by the faint glow outside. She gazed at the open horizon, eyes calm and untroubled. Beneath the drone of the engines, a small smile touched her lips. There was no anthem to send her off, no formal salute. Only the wind and the quiet certainty that everything she had done, however small, had meant something. The C-130 grew smaller, fading into the distance, until only a pale streak of light remained on the horizon. Below, the desert wind stirred again, lifting golden dust into the air, swirling it gently around the black memorial wall. The names carved into the stone shimmered faintly under the setting sun, as if smiling in farewell to their final comrade departing into the sky. If this story made you believe that honor and kindness never retire, share this video and subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten. Brave Veteran Stories. We remember the quiet heroes.